So let's continue the story about ecosystems. We've talked about how big the world is, so the biosphere. We've talked about the three different parts and part of it: hydrosphere, atmosphere, and geosphere. Then we kind of narrowed our thoughts down into the biomes, and that's when you did your biome project, which are due Monday. And now we're going to talk about specifics in biomes. So now that we have a general size and layout of our biome, what are the producers in our biome, we're going to talk some vocabulary and what we're going to focus in for the next part of this. So here are our definitions. So at this point, I'm just going to pull out these definitions. I'm going to roll them out, lay them down, and then let's get them in our notes. All right. So I'm going to quickly speak on to each of these. What I would do before listening to my spiel, I would maybe pause this, write them down so you can listen as I am talking. So big idea, environment. So the environment is everything an organism throughout its life will affect, essentially. It will have an effect on the organism, and that's why we have adaptations and changing. But it also has an effect on the environment. So as it eats different plants, as it interacts with different animals, it has an impact. The next are abiotic and biotic factors. Now, be aware that these two words are going to be very prevalent from here on out through the rest of the chapter. When I talk about living things, I'm referring to the biotic components. And when I'm talking about abiotic things, I'm talking about the non-living components. So non-living being like rocks, dirt, air, things like that. So then we're going to get down to kind of how we go through and go from the narrowest part of an ecosystem to the broadest part of the ecosystem. So every ecosystem has organisms living in it, and those organisms are kind of piled into different categories. The first one is species. So species is a group of organisms that can breed but produce fertile offspring. That is the key part to this. They have to be able to produce fertile offspring. A horse and a donkey can have a baby, and it's called a mule, but that mule cannot have babies. So a horse and a donkey are not the same species. If a lion and a lion had a baby, then yes, same species, because that baby can have babies. So a species is very specifically not just about being able to breed, but to produce fertile offspring. Our population is now taking these species and putting them all together in the same place in the same time. That makes a population. Okay, so individuals of the same species in the same area. That's population. So think of Lion King. Think of all the lions on Pride Rock. That's population. The community now is looking at the interaction of different populations. So you have the lions and the hyenas in Lion King. Those would be a community. Okay, lions mixing with the different animals at the watering hole. That's a community. Okay. Now, if we take those populations and with it include everything that is living and non-living, we now have an ecosystem. So the lions are the species. The population is them all living together at Pride Rock. The community would be them interacting with different things like hyenas, elephants, zebras, things like that. The ecosystem is taking all of that and now putting them in their biome, essentially. So in the grasslands where there's grass and rocks and dirt and water and all that stuff, it also includes the bugs and anything living and non-living. All of this is affected by something called limiting factors. So abiotic and biotic components will allow for populations to grow. But if there is limited amount of food or limited amounts of water, they become limiting factors. They stop the population from getting really big. So that is the start, because we are going to be working in these ideas as we move through the next few slides. So let's talk habitat and niche. So what is it? The habitat of an animal is physically the area they live in. Okay, where do they live? Polar bears in the Arctic, turtles in the ocean, camels in the desert. Okay, this is their habitat. It is very, very dependent upon all the environmental conditions around them, as well as where is it best for them to survive. I cannot take a whale and put him on in the savannah and say, live, it will die. Why? Because that's not the conditions for its best survival. Its habitat is the ocean. Why? Because it is dependent upon the water and it can only survive in the water. So it needs the conditions best for its survival. So now let's talk more broadly about niche. So niche is a word that we use when we talk about a population's complete role in their ecosystem. It is defined usually by the organism's job or role. It includes all the things it needs for survival. And when you have a chance, I want you to watch this video. We will also watch the video linked in here in class. Okay. But essentially, the niche is where it lives, what it eats, and what it does in its ecosystem, in its habitat and ecosystem. So that's essentially habitats and niches. We're going to move into ecosystems. You have a space for producers and consumers. We're going to have to jump back to those, okay? Because we're going to start in ecosystems. So move through your notes to the one that says ecosystems. And here, let's get started. So an ecosystem is made up of everything that lives in an area. All right, we have that definition already down. So moving on. It's living and non-living things working together to cycle energy throughout the planet. Now, when we talk about the interactions inside an ecosystem, we're talking about producers. So this is where we're going to jump back a little bit to the notes right under habitat and niche where it says producers. Producers are also known as autotrophs. Yes, I will use that word. Please underline and highlight it. They are able to use the sun's energy. So essentially plants, guys. Okay, we're talking plants. They obtain their energy by consuming other organisms that are called consumers or heterotrophs. Okay, so producers produce energy via the sun. Anything else is not a producer because they don't use the sun to directly make their energy. Okay, producers are the start of every food chain. So then we have consumers. We base our consumers into a couple different things. We have herbivores, carnivores, tertiary consumers, omnivores, and decomposers, okay? Consumers are also known as heterotrophs. That's from the last slide, okay? So if you need to go back a little bit, rewind, heterotrophs, okay? They obtain their energy by eating other things. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to talk about things that eat things, that are not using the sun's energy, okay? So herbivores start this off by eating plants. Usually if we're talking a food chain, producers are first, herbivores right after because they eat plants.
I was looking for the Chromebook card. Do you know where it is?
It is. All right. Sorry, guys, for the interruption. Let's figure out where we were and let's go back. I apologize. And unfortunately, due to the program I use, I can't edit that out. So where were we? Sorry, let's go back here. Anyways, so we're talking herbivores eat plants, and that's how they get their food. So they're called the first eaters or the first trophic level. Carnivores, we know what carnivores are. They eat other animals. We call them secondary consumers when we're talking about food chains. And then tertiary consumers are usually ones that eat secondary consumers. We're going to look at that here shortly. You also have omnivores. Omnivores eat plants and other animals. And then decomposers decompose animals, absorbing their leftover waste matter and using it as organic and inorganic material and returning it to the soil. So what I do is I pause this slide again, get everything in your notes up until the diagram that says draw a diagram to describe the relationship between producers and all types of consumers. So we will draw that diagram in class Monday. So let's talk feeding levels, okay? So skip past the ecosystem part. We're now into the trophic levels, describe feeding relationships in ecosystems, okay? Just on the side there, if you wouldn't mind defining what a trophic level is by saying trophic is food and trophic level is feeding level. So it's just off on the side. Again, it says draw a diagram of how energy transfers through trophic levels, okay? We're going to do that in class. So if you flip the page to food chain, I would like you to define food chain. It's essentially a linear pathway, so a straight line in which food is transferred from producers to primary consumers to higher trophic levels. Anywhere where it says draw a diagram, guys, I will show you a diagram and you can draw it. So this diagram here on the left side is the diagram of the terrestrial food chain. On the right side is the diagram of the water food chain. So you can put this into your notes in the two diagram places. So pause again and then continue on. So again, that's what's going there and there. And last but not least, we're going to just quickly define a food web and talk about that. So a food web, if you remember from grade 7, is essentially all the connections among different food chains. So how does a food web differ from a food chain? Well, a food web is lots of arrows all over the place. A food chain is a straight line from producer all the way to final consumer. So this is a food web. So we are going to start on Monday slash Tuesday, I should say, actually Tuesday, by designing a top predator. And that's where we're going to start our next part to our activity in our biome project. And we are going to then finish these notes off in the next couple days. So there'll be a couple more things posted, but up until then, this is all you have. So make sure all your notes are filled in from page 7, 8, and 9. Okay. It says examine the food web shown in your notes. Okay. That was just the food web that I had earlier in the video. You can stop and rewind that. All right. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you later.